الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين وصلي وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So inshallah ta'ala, we're going to be going through starting from page 25 in the books, we're going to be going through the different types of tawassul. For the last, 3 or 4 or 5 different classes, we've been focusing on 3 types of tawassul, right? Let's do a little bit of review. Who can remind me what tawassul is? What is tawassul? What is tawassul? What is tawassul? Hanan, what is tawassul?
I have no idea.
What is tawassul?
I just remember one quote from the book. It's the process of supercharging the dua.
The process of supercharging the dua.
Yes.
You know, I spend a lot of time trying to put in nice quotes from scholars and, be very technical and academic about it, and then this is the one thing you remember. The title.
It stood out.
What is tawassul?
To draw near to what one is seeking and to approach something which one desires.
In English.
The act of seeking to draw.
Come on guys, what is tawassul? What is tawassul? What are we talking about when we talk about tawassul in dua? What is tawassul? Anyone from the sisters? Yes?
So like you add extra things to your dua to get them closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Very good, ahsanti. You guys should all be ashamed of yourselves. Bismillah. So, essentially, what the sister was saying was that in the context of dua, tawassul is essentially things that you are adding into the dua to make it more acceptable and be closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Tawassul in its general sense, by the way, refers to the general drawing nearer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and taking the means to draw nearer to Him. And that was the definition that Hanan was reading. So, we talked about tawassul, so we talked about 3 different things so far up to this point that we add into our dua that make them more acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Who can remind me of the first thing? What's the first thing that we add into our duas that make them more acceptable to Allah? See, the dua itself, let's pretend that the dua at its base, at its most fundamental root, it's a request, right? Let's make an example of exams. It's exam time. The request is, make me pass my midterm, right? That's the request. Now, what are the things that we add into this request to make them more acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What's the first one? We just say, make me pass my midterm. Yep?
Did you mention one of the names of Allah?
Very good. Not just one, as many as you can, right? Or as many as you see fit or as many as are relevant to your request. So you beseech Allah by His many names. You don't just say, make me pass me. You ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, oh Allah, I ask you, Ya Allah, Ya Rahman, the one who shows compassion, mercy, etc., etc. So you add names and attributes of Allah into the dua. What's the second? From the sisters. Or another one we talked about. So one of them is you call out to Allah by His names. What else can you add in your dua to make it more acceptable to Allah? Besides the names of Allah and the actual request, what else can you add into it? Yes?
Sending salam to the Prophet.
Very good. Sending salah and salam upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is of the means for the dua being more acceptable. Who can say the last one?
Start with praising and thanking Allah.
Very good, mashallah. You're very active. First class, but know everything, mashallah. That's why you didn't have to come for the past 8 classes, right?
That's why I got the book.
So, essentially, it is by praising and thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So not only are you beseeching Allah by His names and attributes, but you're also praising Allah as well. So it's not just saying Ya Rahman Ya Rahim, which is in and of itself a type of praise, but you are saying وَلَكَ الْحَمْدُ كُلُّ. To you belongs all the praise and all the thanks. Or you're saying Subhanaka wa bihamdik. Far removed are you from imperfection. Subhanak, we talked about tasbih. Or we say things like La ilaha illa ant. There's nothing worthy of worship except you. Or we say Allahu Akbar. Or we say La hawla wa la quwwata illa bik or illa billah. We add these different forms of adhkar within the dua and makes it more acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so, as an example, you want to pass the midterm or whatever, but by the way, we even talked about one of the negative qualities of a dua is if you're only asking for this world. So the first thing to note then, and this was from before the Tawassul discussion, we had a long discussion about what are the things that are considered transgression in dua, things you should avoid in dua. One of the things is only making dua for this world. So actually, it wouldn't be good if you're just asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, make me pass midterm, make me pass midterm, make me pass midterm. And you're not asking Allah for Jannah, forgiveness, protection from hellfire. You're not asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for anything much beyond that, right? You're so focused on the dunya, which shows an underlying mentality that's actually problematic. And so the dua that you would request is adding more things as well, right? Adding more things as well. And so you ask, Ya Allah, Ya Rahman, Ya Rahim, Ya Fattah al-Alim, لك الحمد كثيرا ولك الشكر كثيرا سبحانك وبحمدك سبحان ذي الجبروت والملكوت والكبرياء والعظمة. You make different statements of tasbih and you start the dua like this. And then you can go, and of course these can be done in any language. This can be done in any language. And you say, Allahumma salli wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad. Oh Allah, send your peace and blessings upon Muhammad. Oh Allah, send your peace and blessings upon Muhammad. Allahumma salli wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad. And then you move forward. And then, at this point we have 3, and we're going to mention many other things, we're going to be going through them all. And then you would make your request, oh Allah, I have this need, and help me with this. And then, oh Allah, also it's one of the etiquettes is to start with istighfar. Oh Allah, forgive me for everything, forgive me for everything. And then move forward. And oh Allah, help me with my midterm, oh Allah, help me with my midterm, oh Allah, help me, these types of things. So you see the process of dua, and how the beginning really sets the stage, right? The beginning really sets the stage. Okay, so 3 things of dua. So who can name all the 3 that we just discussed? Quickly. Who can name them? We just discussed the 3. Yes?
Hamd, salawat, and mentioning the names of Allah.
Very good. Everyone got that? If I pick someone randomly, will they be able to say all 3? Okay. Arib.
Hamd, salawat, and mentioning the names of Allah.
Okay, very good. Alhamdulillah. Okay, so moving forward now. So on page 25, and so we spent classes, multiple classes on each of these. Now we're going to kind of go through all of them and finish this page of Tawassul for this class, inshallah. And then we will have just 2 more classes after that. So, one more thing that we can add into the dua to make it more acceptable to Allah is, and this is the first point in page 25, by mentioning a good deed that you did. In the dua, you mention a deed that you did for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the dua itself. And it's been narrated by Anas bin Malik, radiallahu an. Who is Anas bin Malik? Who was Anas bin Malik? Yes? He was one of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. What was he in relation to the Prophet ﷺ?
And I think when he was small, he helped the Prophet.
He was a servant, yeah, exactly. When he was small, he was someone who was dedicated to the service of the Prophet ﷺ. And it was amazing. He said that the Prophet ﷺ never said anything disapproving to me. And I made so many mistakes, and he never said, why did you do that? Or if I didn't do something, he said, why didn't you do that? He never even said that to him. And that's a very, very beautiful point about the character and akhlaq of the Prophet ﷺ, how he understood children, right? Children make mistakes, children do things, and not coming down harsh on them and disciplining them in a harsh way. Anyway, so Anas bin Malik, radiallahu an, was asked by someone to make dua for him. And he replied, this is a very interesting reply, verily du'as are raised up to Allah by good deeds. Verily du'as are raised up to Allah by good deeds. So someone's asking him to make dua, and he says, verily, du'as are raised up to Allah by good deeds. And this is very common, by the way. Companions, early scholars, people would ask them, make dua for me, make dua for me. And many times they would say, no, you make dua for yourself and it will be more accepted to Allah. Hasan al-Basri, it's also been narrated similar to that as well, where a person came to him and he said that, I don't have the same feeling of wanting that thing to come as much as you. You actually want it, it's for your benefit. You have actually, your state is actually something that will bring about the acceptance of dua much better than mine. And so this focus of the early Muslims on not focusing on people to ask dua for other people, but the idea that the personal du'as from the person himself is something that's actually more acceptable than someone who might not have that specific need. And Anas bin Malik here is saying specifically that, hey, you want me to do dua? The whole point of dua is to come closer to Allah. And realize good deeds make the dua. So you make the dua yourself, you do those good deeds. Right? And this is something that we see is very common amongst the companions and early Muslims. And this principle, mentioning good deed in your dua, we see it in the Quran. Du'as in the Quran. For example, it's mentioned in the Quran, رَبَّنَا آمَنَّا فَاكْتُبْنَا مَعَ الشَّاهِدِينَ. Oh Allah, I have believed. This is the good deed you done. I have believed, I have iman. So write me down as those who bear witness. Write me down amongst the righteous, those who bear witness. Oh ربنا إننا سمعنا منادي أن ينادي للإيمان أن آمنوا بربكم فآمنا ربنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار. This is in the end of Surah Al Imran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions a dua here. O our Lord, verily we have heard the caller, the one who calls to Iman, that they say believe in your Lord, so we have believed. This is the action that they've done. O our Lord, so forgive us. فَاغْفِرْ لَنَا ذُنُوبًا وَكَفِّرْ عَنَّا سَيِّئَاتِنَا. Forgive us of our sins. And this is very interesting here. Do kufr of our evil. Make kufr وَكَفِّرْ عَنَّا سَيِّئَاتِنَا. وَكَفِّرْ عَنَّا سَيِّئَاتِنَا. Do kufr of our evil. Cover it up. It's a very beautiful imagery that's mentioned here. And so here, what is the tawassul here? It's mentioning the good state that it is. Oh Allah, when the caller came, when the person came and instructed me to believe, I believe for your sake. So ya Allah, forgive me. So this is mentioning a good deed. There's also a very interesting story that comes to us in the hadith. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ narrated of a story where 3 people were once on a journey and there was a storm that came, a storm that hit. And so they sought refuge in a cave. And when they went to the cave, one of the boulders slashed down. There was a landslide, or there was the rocks fell down, and it covered the mouth of the cave, so they were trapped inside. And they tried to push the boulder, but it was heavy. It's like almost pushing a mountain. And they're like, Subhanallah, we have literally nothing to do. There's no cell phones, you can't call anyone, no texting, WhatsApp, whatever. And so what did they do? They said, one of them said that now is a time in which we must all beseech Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by a good deed that we've done. And so it's narrated that one of them, there's 3 people in the cave, one of them made dua, and his good deed he mentioned, I don't want to go too much in detail, but one good deed he mentioned was basically his birr al-walidain, that he'd had so much birr and good and kind treatment to his parents, and he served his parents. And based on his service, he said, Ya Allah, I did this if I did this sincerely for your sake, seeking your pleasure, then remove this boulder. And then the boulder moved a bit, it nudged. And so the second person made dua, and he said, and the good deed that he mentioned was a very interesting one actually. He fell in love with one of his cousins. He fell in love with one of his cousins, and he wanted to marry her, but she didn't want to marry him. And there was a famine that came, and so she came to him in a very kind of humble position, asking for money. And he said, I'll give you the money on the condition that you commit zina with me. And she was desperate, and so she said, okay, I need the money, I need to eat, it's famine. And when he was about to do that, she said, fear Allah. And so he left her and said, take the money, I'm leaving. He had that fear of Allah, he realized what he did was wrong, and he went back on his ways and he didn't commit the sin. He said, oh Allah, if I did that for your sake, then move the boulder. And the boulder nudged. The third person came, and this is a very beautiful to see the idea of justice in Islam, specifically economic justice. That he made dua to Allah, and there was a person, the good deed was that there was, he had hired workers and he gave them all their wages. But one person, he didn't give their wage. He was not able to find them for their wages. So this money, he invested in. He invested in camels, whatever, the crops and whatnot. And it grew and grew and grew and multiplied until it was a very vast field with a lot of animals and all these different types of things. The man came back and said, I want my wages back. Many years later. And he said, everything you see in front of you is yours. Subhanallah. The justice that he had here, that, I invested this was your money to begin with, and so all of this is yours. And he gave it all to the person. He said, oh Allah, if I did this for your sake, then move the boulder. And then the boulder was finally moved, and they were saved from the cave, and they were able to leave. And so this is the aspect of mentioning a good deed. And so when we're making dua, this is a point for us to reflect upon. Think about something we've done that will be our go-to good deed that we can mention in our du'as. Right? What's our go-to good deed, that something we gave up for the sake of Allah. Something we did for the sake of Allah. And have that confidence and sincerity in it. And if we feel like we don't have anything like that, then now it's time to start working towards that. Now start working towards doing deeds that we can then use in our du'as. And so, oh Allah, I did this. Oh Allah, I stood in the night. I stood in the night here, beseeching you only for your sake. Oh Allah, I read this Quran. I mean, Allah does not belittle any deed as long as the sincerity is there. Oh Allah, I read this Quran. Or I've been reading this much Quran every day, sincerely seeking your pleasure, etc., etc., etc. So, Ya Allah, please. And then you mention your dua. Okay, next point of tawassul. You mention your state of need. You mention your state of need. This is different from mentioning what you want, like the actual request, but you mention your state. So we see this in the Quran, and this is the dua of Zakaria alayhi salam. He says, it is mentioned, قَالَ رَبِّ إِنِّي وَهَنَ الْعَظْمُ مِنِّي وَاشْتَعَلَ الرَّأْسُ شَيْبًا وَلَمْ أَكُنْ بِدُعَائِكَ رَبِّ شَقِيًّا. Zakaria said, "O my Lord, O Allah, indeed my bones have become feeble, have become weak. My gray hair has spread all over my head. And I have never been distressed in my dua to you, O my Lord." So here he's mentioning his state before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no dua, he's not asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for anything. He's not praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's not sending salat and salam upon any prophet. He's not mentioning a good deed that he did. He's mentioning his state. He's saying, this is my state right now. And it's relevant to his request because he's wanting a child. He's wanting a child. And he's saying, look how old I'm getting. Look how old I'm getting. I don't have a child yet. And so he's mentioning his state of need. And so this is also important for us. If we're in a desperate state, if we feel like we're in a sad state, in an anxious state, we're feeling sadness or sorrow, or if we're going through anything in life, this is where you say that to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the dua. You say it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the dua as is mentioned here. You mention your state before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the sunnah as you see of Zakaria alayhi salam in the Quran. So that's the second. The third, and overall, this would be the sixth point of tawassul, is you mention the intended result of the dua. You mention the intended result of the dua. So you're mentioning not just the actual what you want, but you're saying, what will happen if I get this? The result of the dua. And we see here, this is the case, and continuing with the dua of Zakaria that's mentioned in Surah Maryam, he mentions, إني خفت الموالي من ورائي وكانت امرأتي عاقرة فهب لي من لدنك وليا يرثني ويرث من آل يعقوب. Verily I fear my relatives after me since my wife is barren. So give me from yourself an heir who shall inherit me and inherit the family of Yaqub. He's saying, if you give me a son, I will give this son the inheritance. And what's the inheritance of the prophets? What are the inheritance of the prophets? Knowledge. I will give the knowledge, I'll give him that inheritance. I'll make him a good person. And he'll be able to take that from me. And so this is something that we see as part of the etiquettes and tawassul of adding into your dua. You mentioned what's going to happen afterwards. I'm going to pass my midterm and then I'll be able to, I don't know, whatever the nice result it would be at the end. But also we see as well the Prophet ﷺ made this dua at Badr. At Badr, the Prophet ﷺ, before Badr occurred, a beautiful dua, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Oh Allah, if these people are destroyed, if we lose this battle, who will be left on this earth to worship you?" So here it's almost on the reverse. He's saying, if we don't win this battle, then look at the consequences that will happen. So you can do that as well. Saying, "Oh Allah, if this doesn't happen, then X and X and X and Y will happen. Oh Allah, if we don't win this battle, who will be left on this earth to worship you?" And so this is also something that's part of the etiquette. You mentioned the intended result of the dua. Okay, the seventh type of tawassul is you make dua for someone else. In your dua, you make dua for someone else. And we know of the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said in Sahih Muslim, there is no Muslim worshipper who prays for his brother in his absence, or prays for her sister in his absence, or we pray for other Muslims, okay? Except that an angel says, Ameen, and to you the same. So the angel then makes dua for the brother. And it's very interesting here in the Shu'ab al-Iman by Imam al-Bayhaqi, one of the scholars mentioned here, that just like the reason for the dua being accepted for the brother that you made dua for, so you made dua for a brother, so that dua is more likely to be accepted because you made it for him, because the angel is saying Ameen. But what happens? The angel makes dua for you. So it's mentioned then by the scholar that, so we're hopeful that this dua will also be accepted by the angel because the angel made dua for you in your absence. You see this? So there's a dua you're making for someone else in their absence, and then the angel in turn makes dua for you in your absence. You understand this point? And so this is something that we're hopeful that the dua of the angels will be with you. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever seeks forgiveness for the believing men and women, then a good deed will be written for him for every single believing man and woman. Now this is a very powerful hadith. I mean, you can say, oh Allah forgive Abdul Aziz, or Allah forgive Uthman, or you can make these du'as. Or if you say, and then you'll get two rewards because there's two people, right? But if you say, Allahumma ghfir lil muslimina wal muslimat, how many Muslims are there in the world? How many Muslims are there in the world? Over 1 billion. What is this hadith saying? A good deed will be written for him for every single believing man and woman. Subhanallah. Allahumma ghfir lil muslimina wal muslimat. Over 1 billion hasanat. Over 1 billion hasanat. From this one short dua that's mentioned. Allahumma ghfir lil muslimina wal muslimat. And so this is something we should add in our du'as whenever we're making our du'as. Bismillah. Another point of tawassul is to be certain in the response. The Prophet ﷺ said, make dua to Allah and be certain that He will respond to you. وَأَنْتُمْ مُوقُونَ بِالْإِجَابَةِ, that you are certain in the response from Allah. And know that Allah will not respond to the dua of a heart that is heedless of it. If you're making dua just kind of like casually and saying, oh, and then just kind of going, or someone is making dua and you're not really thinking about it, this is the heart that Allah will not accept the dua for. The point of the dua is that connection with Allah Azza wa Jal. And if it's not there, then this is a means of the dua not being accepted. But the more the heart is present in the dua, and that's why this tawassul is necessary. Instead of just asking, oh Allah, have this happen, the things that we're adding here, it builds up. It makes you feel the dua, it makes you feel the state of need. When you mention your state, it's psychologically going to affect your emotions. When you say it, you might know it in your head, but once you say it, it's something different. When you say it, it comes out, the emotions come out. When you mention the intended result, when you mention all these things, it brings about that heart that is cognizant of Allah and not heedless of Allah. The next point, using prophetic du'as. Using prophetic du'as. As mentioned in Surah Al-Imran, قُلْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تُحِبُّونَ اللَّهَ فَاتَّبِعُونِي يُحْبِبُكُمُ اللَّهِ. That say, if you love Allah, then follow me and Allah will love you. What does this mean? The best du'as we can make that are most beloved to Allah are the du'as that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ used to make. Those are the best du'as we can make. And so if we have a specific request, see if this is a request that the Prophet ﷺ used to make dua for as well. And then use his words. Because we know that Allah is pleased and loves the Prophet ﷺ and loves the actions the Prophet ﷺ did. And so we want to be counted of those who Allah loves. And so we follow the Messenger of Allah ﷺ. And so this is important for us to use prophetic du'as. And there are beautiful dua books like Portraits of the Muslim, Hisnul Muslim, which show so many different types of things for so many different occasions, the du'as that the Prophet ﷺ would make. Moving forward, the next aspect of dua is acknowledging one's sins. Acknowledging one's sins in the dua. It's mentioned in Surah Araf. This is something you see that all the prophets would do. In Surah Araf, Adam alayhi salam is mentioned. He said, and with Hawa, his wife, رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا وَإِن لَمْ تَغْفِرْ لَنَا وَتَرْحَمْنَا لَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. The first thing he started his dua with is, oh Allah, we have wronged ourselves, we have done dhulm upon ourselves, acknowledging that sin. And if you don't forgive me, or if you won't forgive us, or show mercy to us, then we'll be of the losers. لَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. I have it translated here as oppressors, I don't know why. It should be khasirin is losers. I'll be of those who have lost. No, لَنَكُونَ مِنَ الظَّالِمِينَ. It is khasirin, no? Yeah. Okay, moving forward. So we also see this in the dua of Yunus. We see this in the dua of Yunus. We see this in the dua of Yunus, Prophet Yunus, where he said, La ilaha illa ant. There is nothing worthy of worship except you. Subhanak. Glory be to you, O Allah. Inni kuntu min al-dhalimin. I have been of the wrongdoers. Certainly I have been of the ones who wronged themselves. Acknowledging that sin. We see this as well in Sayyidul Istighfar, the dua that the Prophet ﷺ used to make for istighfar. And it's mentioned here that اللهم أنت ربي لا إله إلا أنت خلقتني وأنا عبدك وأنا على عهدك ووعدك ما استطعت أعوذ بك من شر ما صنعت أبوء لك بنعمتك علي وأبوء بذنبي. Sorry, I had to say the whole thing. I forgot the أبوء بذنبي. وأبوء بذنبي. Here, and I admit to you, I admit, أبوء بذنبي, Abu is not, I admit, I acknowledge my sin. وأبوء بذنبي. I acknowledge my sin, I acknowledge my sin. فاغفر لي فإنه لا يغفر الذنوب إلا أنت. So forgive me, for verily none forgives except you. And there's a beautiful hadith that's mentioned as well in Jami' at-Tirmidhi. The Prophet ﷺ said, لا إله, that when a believer says, لا إله إلا أنت ظلمت نفسي, there's nothing worthy of worship except you. ظلمت نفسي, I have wronged myself, I have committed dhulm upon myself. فاغفر لي, so forgive me. فَإِنَّهُ لَا يَغْفِرُ الذُّنُوبَ إِلَّا أَنْتَ. For verily, none forgives except you. Is mentioned that Allah responds and says, my servant knows that he has a Lord that forgives and punishes. Allah responds to that dua. And so acknowledging the sin is part of the things that we add into the dua to make our istighfar more acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, moving forward, the next kind of point is the emotional state. And the emotional state, really, these things that we mentioned leads to this emotional state that we're going to mention now. These things lead to the emotional state of the heart. What are the emotions? Humility, hope, awe, and fear. أُدْعُوا رَبَّكُمْ تَضَرُّعًا وَخُفْيًا. Call upon your Lord with humility and in secret. And it's also mentioned, إِنَّهُمْ كَانُوا يُسَارِعُونَ فِي الْخَيْرَاتِ وَيَدْعُونَنَا رَغَبًا وَرَهَبًا. That, and this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talking about Zakaria and his wife and his family, that verily they used to call upon us رَغَبًا وَرَهَبًا, with fear and with hope. What would they be fearing? They'd be fearing that they are displeasing Allah. They'd be fearing that their dua would not be accepted. But what is their hope? That no matter how bad that they may feel themselves to be, that the rahmah of Allah outweighs any type of sin that we can do. And they're hopeful that Allah will respond to their prayer, that will respond to their dua. The Prophet ﷺ said, and this is moving forward here, crying as well. This is part of the emotional state. Crying is something that we know is one of the means for a dua being accepted. Is it a sign? It's a sign of a dua being accepted, is if a person cries. This again comes from the emotional state. Once you do the other things, this will come naturally. And it's mentioned in Sahih Muslim, a very beautiful hadith. The Prophet ﷺ, he recited Surah Ibrahim, ayah 36, and Surah Ma'idah, ayah 118. And what are these ayat? In Surah Ibrahim, it is the ayah of the dua of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Ibrahim alayhi salam makes a dua. And he says that, وَمَنْ تَبِعَنِي فَإِنَّهُ مِنِّي. Whoever of mankind follows me, then they are from me. وَمَنْ عَصَانِي. And whoever rejects me, فَإِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْغَفُورُ الرَّحِيمُ. SubhanAllah. This is the kindness and the love and compassion of Ibrahim. He didn't say, whoever disobeys me, then deal with them, O Allah. Then you are the one who is swift in punishment. No. Whoever disobeys me and turns away from me, you are the most forgiving and the most merciful. He wants them to be forgiven. He wants them to be guided back to the path. And He has that sense of gentleness to them. Contrast with Isa alayhi salam. On the day of judgment, a dua is mentioned. Jesus, Isa alayhi salam, we know that on the day of judgment, Allah will come and Jesus will come and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will ask him, أَأَنْتَ قُلْتَ لِلنَّاسِ اتَّخِذُونِي وَأُمِّيَ إِلَهَيْنِ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. Did you tell the people to take you, and did you tell the people, oh, take me and my mother as gods besides Allah? قَالَ سُبْحَانَكَ مَا يَكُونُ لِي أَنْ أَقُولَ مَا لَيْسَ لِي بِحَقٍّ إِن كُنْتُ قُلْتُهُ فَقَدْ عَلِمْتَ. Glory, how far removed are you away? Glory be to you, far removed are you from perfection. I would not ever say anything except what is true. And if I ever said anything, it is from what you taught me. And then it goes on and he says that I was a witness for them, مَا دُمْتُ فِيهِمْ, for as long as I was with them. فَلَمَّا تَوَفَّيْتَنِي أَنْتَ كُنْتَ الرَّقِيبَ عَلَيْهِمْ. And when I was taken away, you were a witness over them. And then he moves forward and then he says, subhanallah, a very scary statement. He says, وَإِن تُعَذِّبُهُمْ فَإِنَّهُمْ عِبَادُكَ. If you wish to punish them, then they are your slaves. وَإِن تَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ فَإِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. And if you forgive them, then very you are the one full of authority and full of wisdom and hikmah. Now just pause here. It's a very interesting point and note here, because here he says, whoever, if you choose to forgive them, then you are Aziz and Hakim. And this kind of goes away from the general pattern that when we talk about forgiveness, then the names would be Ghafur Rahim. A very interesting reflection, especially when dialoguing and speaking with people of the Christian faith, is that one of the biggest problems that they have with the idea of sin is they say, how can God just forgive sin like that? How can God just forgive sins like that? And so it's very interesting, when we talk about Isa alayhi salam, what are the names that are mentioned? Al-Aziz, the one full of authority. The one who has full, and Al-Hakim, the one with wisdom. That the forgiveness of God, you're saying, how can God forgive? He has full authority, He's Al-Aziz. And what is He based forgiveness on? Al-Hakim, He's wise as well. And so it's a very interesting point here that these are the names that are mentioned. But here, so Isa alayhi salam makes this dua on the Day of Judgment. وَإِن تُعَذِّبُهُمْ فَإِنَّهُمْ عِبَادُكَ وَإِن تَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ فَإِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. And the Prophet ﷺ, when he recited this, he began to cry. Because he's picturing, because Isa alayhi salam is seeing his ummah. Ibrahim alayhi salam, he's seeing his ummah. And the Prophet ﷺ is then thinking of his ummah. That if this is the case, that these prophets are not able to intercede for the people who disobeyed them, then how will I help my ummah? What about people in my ummah who are Muslim but turned away from my teaching, that turned away from me? What about these people? That fear that the Prophet ﷺ felt, he started to cry. And this is the love that the Prophet ﷺ had for each one of us. He said, Oh Allah, ummati, ummati. Oh Allah, my ummah, my ummah. And then Allah sent Jibreel alayhi salam to ask the Prophet ﷺ why he was crying. And of course Allah knew. And then Jibreel inquired to the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ responded that he was crying out of the care for his ummah. Allah said, O Jibreel, go to Muhammad and say, we will please you regarding your followers and will not cause you to grieve. And this is the tafsir of the famous ayah in Surah Duha. وَلَسَوْفَ يُعْطِيكَ رَبُّكَ فَتَرْضَى. You will soon be given. وَلَسَوْفَ يُعْطِيكَ. You will soon be given from your Lord, فَتَرْضَى. And you will be pleased. SubhanAllah. When you read this ayah about the Prophet ﷺ, that you will soon be given, you'll be pleased, you think, oh, he's going to get Jannah, But SubhanAllah, that's not what the Prophet ﷺ was after. Ayat and revelation came down, consoling the Prophet ﷺ, not about his fate, but about our fate. He needed that consoling because he felt sad. He loves each and every one of us. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, you will be pleased. You will be pleased. And so we see here that crying is something that is part and a sign that a dua is being accepted. And the last point, saying Ameen. Saying Ameen. Saying Ameen, the Prophet ﷺ said in hadith that when the Imam says Ameen, and this is specifically in the Salah, then say Ameen, for indeed the one whose Ameen coincides with the Ameen of the angels will have his previous sins forgiven. And so this is, of course, saying Ameen. And we know, of course, by the way, people ask the question about if I'm saying Surah Fatiha outside the Salah, should I make Ameen? And it's mentioned that, yeah, it should be also made outside the Salah as well, but you should have a pause after the Ameen before moving forward, so as to differentiate Quran from non-Quran. What does Ameen mean? What does Ameen mean? Ameen is essentially you are saying, Oh Allah, respond to our supplication. Oh Allah, respond. You're saying essentially everything that was said above, respond to it, Oh Allah. Everything that was said, respond to it, Oh Allah. And that's why when someone else makes a dua, you can just say Ameen, and that dua will also apply to you as well. Right? Now, what about the question, okay, we talked about the importance of saying Ameen, and this is something that's mentioned as a seal to your du'as as well. It's mentioned as this as well, that the Ameen is a seal to your du'as. Questions in a bit. can we say Ameen when we're making personal du'as? So I'm saying, oh Allah, forgive me, Ameen. Oh Allah, help me with my midterm, Ameen, right? And it's mentioned here that there's nothing explicit to forbid it, and there's nothing explicit necessarily to say that this is the case. Sheikh Bakr Abu Zayd was a contemporary scholar. He mentioned that it is permissible because there's a general encouragement for saying Ameen, and there's no evidence to restrict it when you're doing it personally. And so the Ameen in the personal du'as is acceptable as well. He said this is something permissible, that when you're making personal du'as, you can say Ameen as well after that. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. So that is saying Ameen. So from this, we now come to the conclusion of all the things that we put into the du'a in order to make it more acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are things that we put into the du'a. We're going to move forward inshallah. So page 27. Page 27 we have extrinsic tawassul. So if you remember, I made the categorization of tawassul into two categories. The first was intrinsic tawassul. Things we add into the du'a that make it more acceptable to Allah. Now the second category, now we finished alhamdulillah. I think this is the fourth or fifth class on tawassul. Now this is the extrinsic tawassul. Things that you don't add into the dua itself. It's not like you're adding content into the dua, but things outside the dua, external factors that make the dua more acceptable to Allah. You seek out these external factors. So what are these external factors? Number one, doing good deeds before the dua. So not in your dua itself, but before you make dua, you're saying, okay, I'm going to read some Quran and then I'm going to do the dua. So the Quran is not in the dua, but you do the deed before to make it more acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is from the same narration and athar that we mentioned of Anas bin Malik radiallahu anh, where when someone asked him to make dua for them, he replied, verily du'as are raised up to Allah by good deeds. Another form of extrinsic tawassul is by you asking a living righteous person to make dua for you. And so this is the idea that then he will also make dua for you. And so you have multiple people asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for you. It's not in your dua, it is someone else's dua, so you're going outside, it's external. And Umar al-Khattab radiallahu anh said during a drought after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, O Allah, we used to do tawassul through your Prophet, and now we are going to do tawassul through the uncle of your Prophet. Who is he referring to here? Oh, it's mentioned. Al-Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, the father of the famous Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma. And actually when you say Abdullah ibn Abbas, actually the etiquette is to say radiallahu anhuma. What's the difference between radiallahu anhu and radiallahu anhuma? What's the non-Arabs? What's the difference? Yes.
Huma is a delineation of the noun for two people.
Very good. Very proper too. Delineation. MashaAllah. So yeah, huma is dual and hu is singular. So what is the dual? When we say Abdullah ibn Abbas, we're referring to one person. Why are we saying, may Allah be pleased with both of them? How do we understand that? Yeah?
It's for his father.
Because in the name Abdullah ibn Abbas is the father, right? Abbas. So you're saying radiallahu anhuma, the son and the father. This is also the case for another famous companion, Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma. And so this is just general etiquette. It's not something that is a must or a wajib or anything like that. Anyways, the point of the hadith is that here, during the Prophet ﷺ's time, they would obviously ask the Prophet ﷺ to make dua for them. But he said, now that the Prophet ﷺ has passed away, we are then going to go to his uncle to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was during a drought when they needed to beseech Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the drought to end in Medina. And so they went through and they asked Abbas radiallahu anh to make dua for the situation. Now, the question comes, and a lot of people have the question of, what's the higher level? Is it better for me to ask someone to make dua for me? Or should I not ask someone to make dua for me and just make dua on my own? The general rule is that for specific needs, the higher level is to make dua yourself. For specific needs, the higher level is to make dua yourself and not to ask anyone else to make dua for you for a specific need. Meaning you have a specific need that needs to be fulfilled, whether that be in your career path, whether that be in a relationship issue or with family or whatever the hardship you're going through, that specific hardship, the higher level is to direct it only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not tell someone else, hey, I'm trying to do X and X, make dua that this happens for me. It's permissible But the higher level is not to do it. Is that clear? Okay. Now, we know of course that there is another type of asking someone to make your dua for you, and that is a general dua, not for a specific need. You're just saying something, hey, remember us in your du'as. Remember me in your du'as. This general is something that doesn't contradict the higher level. Because what is it said when you're saying remember in your du'as, is you're encouraging him to do good deeds. Because when he makes dua for someone else, it's a good deed for him. It's just a general encouragement of amr bil ma'ruf and encouraging us to do good deeds. Moving forward, and this is the last point I'm going to mention. Actually, for the next couple of pages, I'm actually not going to go through it. This is for your benefit. I compiled this for your benefit. This is seeking out specific times, places, and situations. Extrinsic tawassul. It's not about you adding anything into your du'as, but you just look for times to make du'a in that are more blessed and that are more acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or you seek out places that that the du'as are more acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or you seek out specific situations in which the du'a is more accepted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I have here, you can go forward, that there are the different situations and whatnot in which it's mentioned that this is something that is more accepted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is for your benefit to go through, inshaAllah. But we will gloss over that and move to page 35. And this is the last point we're going to conclude with. It's a very short section, just literally 2 pages. And that is the morning and evening du'as and adhkar. The morning and evening du'as and adhkar. And it's really linked to the idea of tawassul and the idea of extrinsic tawassul in the sense that you're seeking out a specific time for du'as. But it's so significant that it deserves its own discussion in its own right. The morning and evening adhkars. I mean, this is something that you don't see being as emphasized as really it should be amongst the Muslims. The importance and significance of the morning and evening adhkar and du'as. The virtues of the remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these times, of the virtues, number 1, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that they deserve the company of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is huge. They deserve the company of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah commands the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Quran, وَاصْبِرْ نَفْسَكَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ. In the morning and the evening. Allah is commanding the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, be patient with those who call, يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُم, those who make dua to their Lord in the morning and the evening. And of course, we aren't blessed to be in the company of the Prophet ﷺ, so we can hope that this would mean if we are people who make the evening and morning adhkar and du'as, that we will be blessed with the company of the Prophet ﷺ in the next life. The second point of the virtues of the morning and evening adhkar. There are only 2 options. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala presents 2 options. وَاذْكُرْ رَبَّكَ فِي نَفْسِكَ تَضَرُّعًا وَخِيفًا. So remember your Lord within yourself in humility and fear, not gear, it should be fear. دُونَ الْجَهْرِ مِنَ الْقَوْلِ, without apparent in speech. بِالْغُدُوِّ وَالْأَصَالِ, in the mornings and the evenings. وَلَا تَكُمْ مِنَ الْغَافِلِينَ, and don't be of those who are heedless. So there's 2 options being presented. You either remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the morning and evening, or you will be of those who are heedless. And so part of ghafla and heedlessness is being heedless of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during these times of the day and night. Being heedless and not thinking of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is part of heedlessness. Of the virtues of the morning and evening adhkar is that it is commanded specifically by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to specifically remember Allah during this time. Right after the general command, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu dhkurullaha dhikran kathira, O you who profess iman, remember Allah with much remembrance. It's mentioned, وَسَبِّحُهُ بُكْرَةً وَأَصِيلًا, and make tasbih of Him specifically in the bukratan wa asila, in the morning and the evening. And so it is specifically commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. After the command for dhikr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses this time in this form of dhikr as well, tasbih, to be done by the believer. The last point and last benefit, the last virtue, is that it keeps the adhkar constant. Or it's not the last one, but it keeps the adhkar constant. And this is a beautiful quote by Bakr Abu Zayd, where he says that it is he's talking about morning and evening adhkar. It is the fortress of the Muslim, his protection, his clothing, and the means for protection from evil or harm. Just like how a house protects one from the heat, cold, and the enemies. And so here the idea that when you're doing this in the morning and the evening, it keeps you consistent in remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because morning and evening comes all the time. Morning, evening, morning, evening, morning, evening. And so it's constantly going to be coming up, and it keeps you consistent. If you make sure that you are regular in your morning and evening adhkar, then it's something that you can be confident that, alhamdulillah, every day I'm going to be doing this appropriate dhikr and remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Other points, and this point that I want to mention is why, what is the significance of the morning and evening? Number one, we know that it is the change of shift of the angels. It is this change of shift of the angels. And so it is always good that when the angels go back to Allah, that they are going back, seeing you in a state of dhikr. And so that when Allah asks them, what have you left them? What state have you left my slave? They were doing your dhikr. When they come in and when they come out. Right? And so this is one of the significances of this time, the spiritual significance. On a more, it's still a spiritual level, but on a more observable, empirical level, this is an interesting point. And this is the idea that the sunrise and sunset, even to a non-believer, are two times in the day that are instinctively seen as something that is very beautiful, very majestic, very awe-inspiring. You know, it's very interesting actually, when I went to Japan, we were thinking of climbing Mount Fuji. We're thinking of climbing Mount Fuji, you know that big mountain with the white and then there's the cherry blossoms and whatnot. So we were thinking of climbing Mount Fuji, and it was interesting because in all the guides and in all the tourist pamphlets, it always encouraged the climbers to climb at nighttime so that when they reached the top, it would be sunrise. And it was very interesting. I found the wording they chose very interesting. It said that because the view of sunrise from Mount Fuji, apparently it's beautiful in terms of the colors, like there's purples and pinks and yellows. I mean, it's just a beautiful display. And it said that it is a very spiritual and awe-inspiring experience. And I thought, subhanAllah, within the human being's fitrah is that they feel spiritual and they feel this sense of transcendence when they're looking at the sunrise and sunset. And it makes perfect sense that why tasbih in the morning and the evening is so heavily emphasized within our tradition. That this is the time that you're instinctively feeling a sense of awe, instinctively feeling a sense of beauty of this creation. You're just inspired. I mean, even beyond, forget Mount Fuji, Japan, even in our times, the idea of sunrise and sunset is seen as something that's an experience, right? It's seen as something that's romantic as well. And so, all these types of feelings and stuff that are evoked from this scene, the point here is that this is prime time for us to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a means of us really getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Trust me, when you make dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and make his tasbih while you're looking at this period of time, it's a beautiful experience. Because it's not just you're making dhikr of Allah and you're here, you're looking at concrete and whatnot, right? But there, the environment, everything around you, the birds and everything, and that's, by the way, also the time that all the birds start chirping as well. Sunrise and sunset. I'm not saying that this is their dhikr or whatever, but you know, only Allah knows what their dhikr is, but it's a very interesting point that sunrise, sunset, that's when the birds go chirping, 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 chirping. So the point here is that this is one of the significances of the morning and evening adhkar. Now, to conclude, what is the time period of morning and evening? We've been mentioning it many times actually in this class. And it seems that at least the most conservative opinion, which would be the most safest opinion, is that morning is the period between Salat al-Fajr and before Shuruq. So this time period, after you pray Salat al-Fajr, this is the time for the morning dhikr or the morning du'as. And then for the evening, it is the time between Asr and Maghrib. So it's actually going to be around this time. Inshallah ta'ala, it's good that we're going to end early now. So then inshallah ta'ala, instead of talking stuff, we can make du'as and we can make our morning and evening adhkar, inshallah ta'ala, for the next about 6-7 minutes, inshallah. And so these are the most conservative opinions as to the timings for morning and evening adhkar. Okay, what happens if you miss out, you know, halaqah, go blabbing on and on and Maghrib time is gone? There are other opinions as well regarding to the morning and evening, and they all have basis to it. And so the idea is that no matter what, even if, for example, you know, it's after Maghrib, you can still say your evening adhkar. You can still say your evening adhkar. You know, you see some of the opinions is that the evening is from Zawal to after sunset. The evening is from Zawal to after sunset. So this is actually, and the morning is from Shuruq to Zawal. So the idea is that if you missed out on, the evening adhkar can be made earlier than Asr itself. And then you have the other one, which is Zawal to midnight, then midnight to Zawal. This opinion is the most liberal, because at every point in time, it's time for either evening or morning adhkar. There's no time period where there is no morning and evening adhkar. And so, the idea behind this and showing the diversity of opinion is to show that even if you miss this time, don't say, okay, it's done, I'm not going to do it. No, still say your evening adhkar if it's after Maghrib. Still say your morning adhkar if it's after Fajr. And inshallah, we are hopeful in the reward from Allah Azza wa Jal. What are the morning and evening adhkar? There are specific narrated mashru' du'as and adhkar that have been narrated to us. And you can just look at Hisn al-Muslim and the Fortunes of the Muslim, and they're all right say there, yes?
The Zawal is noon, right?
Sorry, yeah. Zawal is the about 10-15 minutes before Dhuhr time. It's not 12 p.m. necessarily. Now it's like what, like 120 probably, 115? When is Dhuhr coming?
Yeah, 1:30.
So like 1:15 to like 1:30 is Zawal time. It's the time in which the sun is directly above us.
زوال الظل. زوال الظل. الظل.
Yeah, the sun shadow.
Shadow.
Yeah.
Shadow.
Oh, Zawal. The idea is Zawal means cease, right? La yazid Zawal. So he's explaining the Zawal is of the dhil. The Zawal. The reason why it's called Zawal is because the shadow stops when it's right above us, and there's very little shadow, depending where you are. We're not going to go into that. Bismillah. So yeah, there's those narrated forms, but we also learn from the ayah in the Quran. I mean, even if we don't know the narrated forms, general tasbih is something that is there, or general du'as. يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ. So this is also included within morning, evening times, general du'as, general adhkar. So inshallah ta'ala, with that we will conclude, and inshallah ta'ala we will engage in our morning, evening adhkar, and our evening adhkar. And it's something, by the way, which should be a very blessed gathering as well, because the gatherings of people remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and making his tasbih and tahleed and takbir is a means for everyone in the gathering to be forgiven by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so inshallah ta'ala, we will do that until